But now I want to move to national politics and talk about the Supreme Court. It wrapped a consequential term, one of the most consequential in years, handing President Trump big wins and losses. He was happy in some moments, not so happy in others. Big rulings on birthright citizenship. It was upheld. Transgender athlete bans were upheld as well. Campaign finance limits were talked about, among many other things. So helping us make sense of it all and the overall trends and what we should take away from this session is Eric Segall, professor of law at Georgia State University. Professor Segall, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Good morning, Rachel. How are you?
I'm doing well. Of course, I want to get to birthright citizenship. I think that was one that made headlines for good reason. But I want to start with the Supreme Court's proclivity to expand presidential power. Talk about that and how that you saw that come up in this term.
So this was a big term for the increase of presidential power, despite the fact that months ago the court did strike down the tariffs plan that President Trump wanted to put forward. But in the last week or so, there have been a couple of decisions that have really increased presidential power. The most important one being the Lisa Cook decision that basically says for all independent agencies, meaning the FTC, the FCC, the SEC, we can go on those, the president has to have the unilateral power, unconditional power to fire the heads of independent agencies. The court issued that decision 10 minutes, literally, after it issued a different decision saying, except for the Federal Reserve. When it comes to the Federal Reserve Bank, then the president's power can be limited in terms of firing the officials, but that's the only exception. The court tried to distinguish the Federal Reserve on historical grounds. I don't think the court did a good job on that. So the real deal here is that officials at, for example, the Federal Communication Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Election Commission are now subject to presidential firing without any restrictions. That's not what Congress intended. It greatly increases presidential power.
And of course, that's going to extend beyond President Trump's term. If there's a Democratic president who comes into office next, they too will have these powers.
Maybe yes, maybe no. Certainly
okay.
The rationale of these two decisions would suggest that. But remember, the Federal Reserve decision, it's really hard to square that decision with the other one because whatever reasons the court led to creating a carve-out for the Federal Reserve could apply to future agencies as well, depending on the court's political positions on those agencies. So it's hard to say what the future holds. But there's no question for the time being, this decision greatly increased presidential power.
Yeah. So I want to get now to some of the decisions that made some headlines. Birthright citizenship being upheld, a breath of relief for many folks I know in our community and others around the country. Did this decision surprise you? Of course, there's a Republican leaning majority on the Supreme Court, so President Trump wasn't happy about this decision. But I saw you shake your head that you were not surprised about this.
So it was a surprise that it was 5-4 on the constitutional question. That was the surprise. Justice Kavanaugh, the reason it was 5-4 was Justice Kavanaugh said that a federal statute was inconsistent with President Trump's executive order, so the order had to give way. But Kavanaugh agreed with Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch that the executive order under the Constitution was valid. This was an easy case. We have known for 100 and some odd years that if you're born in America, you're an American citizen, unless you're the child of a marauding army, which we don't have in America, or a diplomat, which has its own special rules. And Justice Roberts, writing for the majority, made it very clear that this has been the very obvious rule for a long time, and it's going to continue to be the rule. Really, the Fourth Amendment is very clear. If you're born in America and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, you're an American citizen. And that's what the rule is. So the surprise was 4 other justices didn't agree with that. This is a big loss for President Trump. I will say that I think Justice Roberts understood that if the Supreme Court had ruled the other way on this, it would have been an incredibly unpopular and historic decision that likely would have caused great disrepute for the court going forward. And I suspect that's why he voted the way he did.
I want to talk about campaign finance because an issue that actually polling shows that Americans overwhelmingly agree on is that they want less money in politics. But this decision doesn't really go along with that sentiment.
So it's interesting. So yesterday was the last day of the term, and the first case the court announced was the transgender rights case, which we may talk about, which of course the American people and the media were very interested in. The third case was the birthright citizenship case, was the case everybody was watching. In between those two, they very intentionally sandwiched an incredibly important and certainly unpopular
Yes.
campaign finance decision, which basically said that from now on, a federal statute the court had upheld 20 years ago, they reversed that decision, said this federal law is unconstitutional under the First Amendment. That law said that political parties could not spend unlimited money on candidates in consultation with the candidates. And the reason we had that law is because it is still the law in America, even today, that you can't just give unlimited money to the candidate of your choice. There's a limit on how much money we can donate to political candidates. There's a good reason for that. We don't want people saying, I'll give you $1 million for your campaign if you promise to vote X, Y, and Z. Well, that's just bribery. And law forbids that. So the other law that was struck down yesterday said, if you can get around that rule by just giving the money to a political party and then them spending it directly with the candidate, then the donation rules don't really have any teeth. Well, I have bad news for the American people. The donation rules no longer have any teeth. And if I want to give more than the limited federal amount, $7,000, to the candidate of my choice, now all I have to do is give a ton of money to the Republican Party or the Democratic Party and say, spend this on the candidate of my choice, and they will, and that evades all the donation rules. The bottom line is this makes money in politics even more present, even more important. And I think polls show the American people want to go in the other direction. One last thing about this. There is no reasonable argument. I'm not an originalist, meaning I don't believe we're stuck with the meaning of the Constitution in 1791 or 1868. But 5 of the current justices say they are originalists. There was not a single originalist rationale for this decision. A policy choice made by judges who normally claim it's not supposed to be their job to make policy choices. It's really an unfortunate decision.
And, like you said, coming on the heels of Citizens United, a famous case from 2010, I believe. Let's move on to the transgender athletes case, another one that you said made headlines. So, on birthright citizenship, the court went against President Trump's wishes. On this case, they agreed that transgender athlete bans can be upheld. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are the court probably got this result correct. Some of the opinion was broader than needed to be, but I don't think the 14th Amendment has a lot to say about public school sports teams and how we should think about trans women. In that context, that the court held that states can prevent trans women from playing on women's and girls sports teams in public schools and colleges. But I also want to say this is an issue that requires nuance and requires thought on the part of legislatures, not the Supreme Court. I think the Supreme Court was right to leave this to the states. However, I don't think these blanket bans are necessarily the best policy choice. I think we should be a little bit more careful in how we delineate all this, but I do think the court's decision was correct. And then one last thing. I will say that Justice Thomas's concurring opinion was extremely insensitive to this entire issue and reflected a lot of animus and bigotry against trans folks. You don't need to have that bigotry and animus to reach the result the majority reached, and I wish Justice Thomas hadn't engaged in that kind of rhetoric. Can I say one thing? The most cases of the term we haven't talked about yet. Believe it or not.
Yeah.
And the most important cases of the term were the voting rights cases. And I know you've talked about that before on your channel, but I just want to say those cases were not yet this week, but really the Voting Rights Act has been invalidated by the Supreme Court of the United States. That has incredible consequences for Georgia,
Yes.
for the country, and is really, this term will be remembered most for the conservative Republican evisceration and destruction of the Voting Rights Act.
And of course, a decision was made not to go redraw those maps before the midterms here in Georgia. even with that decision from the Supreme Court, which I think some found surprising. Clearly, some allies on the court, including Clarence Thomas for President Trump, but President Trump did not put him on the court. He put Amy Coney Barrett, Neil Gorsuch, and Brett Kavanaugh. And I think President Trump expected those to be allies to vote with him at all times. But you've said this many times, it might be a conservative court, but not necessarily a Trump court, even with him having 3 of his own justices on there.
So all Supreme Courts from the beginning of time, from 1803 to today, are driven by ideology. And by ideology, I mean their fundamental values, because their job description is it's a committee of 9. And if you convince 4 of the people of your point of view, that's 5, you can make unreviewable decisions because constitutional amendments are really hard. And in our country, we leave questions like abortion, affirmative action, gun rights, to this Supreme Court. So it's always been ideological, but the court hasn't always been partisan. For example, Justice Kennedy, a Republican, wrote the only 4 gay rights opinions in American history supporting gay rights on a constitutional level. Justice White was appointed by John F. Kennedy, a Democrat, but voted conservative much of the time. So our Supreme Court has not always been partisan. It has always been ideological. The Roberts Court, however, is partisan in the sense that it favors Republican Party policies. And it has done that since 2006 consistently. 3 of the justices worked on Bush versus Gore in 2000 for George Bush. I'm not criticizing this. I'm just describing it. Their core values are partisan loyalty to the Republican Party, and frankly, religion is a big value for this court, as well as a strong executive. So this is not a MAGA court, because I still think even in America today, the Republican Party and MAGA aren't exactly the same thing. They're of course very much aligned. But most of these justices came of age, all the justices came of age, long before Donald Trump's, political career. So what they are devoted Republicans. And that is why the most important cases of this term were the voting rights cases, because those cases are much more likely that Republicans will be elected, not just in Georgia, but all over the country. And that has been the dominant preoccupation of the Roberts Court, furthering the values of the Republican Party. And I just want to say, were there 6 Democrats on the court who had the same kind of political careers as these 6 Republicans, they would be doing exactly the same thing. This is a problem with the institution, not with the people on the institution.
Yeah. All right. I want to thank you so much. This was such a fascinating discussion. I'm someone who's always been interested in the Supreme Court. I did the run of the interns when I was coming up in the industry. So this has been fascinating. Thank you so much, Professor Segall, for your time.
My pleasure. Have a great day.